Good afternoon and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Corinne and I will be your moderator today. As you are logging in, feel free to chat in where you are joining us from today. We are excited to welcome Eric Pook, President of Cirrus Consulting Group, as our speaker. He will be highlighting the 3 critical factors when choosing the ideal location for your practice. Before we get started, we do have a few reminders for you. At any point during the webinar, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we will be answering them live at the end. And Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. Eric, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.
Perfect. So I've been looking forward to this for a while. The equipment and technology team asked for some interesting content. And really, this addresses the question that I get probably 5 to 10 times a week. So I figured it was perfect timing to share a little bit about, right, post-COVID-ish type thing. What does the market currently look like? And how do we help to answer the age-old question? Do I buy my real estate or do I lease? And we're going to talk about all the sort of subcategories to that as well. So let that be a relocation, what's involved, or expansion, or opening up a new satellite location, which is becoming increasingly popular. So really looking forward to it. So again, feel free for some fun, making sure that everything works. The chat, you can add where you're coming from, what part of the country you're coming from today, and also Q&A. I'll try to cover those as we go. I've got a multi setup here today. So any of the questions you have, feel free to throw it in the Q&A. We just did one on Tuesday, different topic, but we had almost 50 questions when we were doing that on the lease, how to create the dental office lease if you own, and also some tax efficient strategies with Bob Gray. So if you haven't registered for the Henry Schein Dental Academy email list, strongly suggest it, because that's a good part 1 to this part 2, to really make sure that if you are contemplating buying the piece of real estate, or you have already, right, and how to then structure your lease to be tax efficient based on your specific situations. So that's another great webinar that you can see by going through the Dental Business Institute Digital Academy. All right, let's jump in. Great attendance here today and lots of registrants, and happy Friday, everybody. So without further ado, we've got lots of things to run through. First of all, a lot of questions we get, again, buying versus leasing. What is the better option for you and your practice? So we're going to dive into that age-old question. In addition to that, why? Why is it essential to consider demographics, data, market data in terms of your location certs and acquisitions? It might seem, commonplace. However, you would be so surprised when someone makes a decision without the proper data, right? Someone puts an offer into to buy or to lease without knowing what the availability reports are, or without knowing what other dental office leases have been negotiated for in the area, and going in basically ill-prepared. And then number 3 is, as you're contemplating, right, buying versus leasing, where does the lease fit in? And how does that contract either help to reduce risk, right, or protect yourself, and or help or could potentially hinder the eventual sale of your clinic? And for those of you that think that, hey, you know what, Eric, I own my own building and I own my own practice. I don't need a lease. I'm just paying it from one pocket to the other. We're definitely going to be touching on that today. I think you might be quite surprised. So for those of you that haven't heard of us before, welcome. Cirrus Consulting Group, we're pretty unique. We are the only healthcare specialized dental tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. So this is it. This is all we do. And therefore, we have a pretty incredible team that's involved. We have our consulting team that works with our clients prior to being routine, just to talk about life, talk about the practice, goals, etc., and help to design a negotiation treatment plan, if you will. Then, once we're retained, we have our real estate operations and analytics team that help to pull all of the real estate data from coast to coast. So if you're just a little curious about rental rates, market rates, vacancy rates in your area, right? This is a great opportunity to do that. You can also, there'll be a few options throughout, but you can also email us anytime, the address at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. And we can certainly pull up some of that data for you and schedule a call. And then also we have our lease negotiation team, which is great. We've got multiple attorneys on staff. We have some of our team have come from a business background. They've been negotiating dental office leases for 18 years. So some incredible experience. And also we have some that used to work for the landlords. They used to negotiate against doctors. So now we brought them on from the dark side to now help represent the doctor in the dental office lease negotiation. So on that note, really looking forward to diving in. So I spoke earlier, about the data and the quality of data, and to make sure that just as you're getting prepared to go in for a surgery, everything's laid out in advance. You have all the information you need. Everything's up, everything's ready to go, so that when you come in, right, to perform surgery, you're ready to go. And you can almost do a blindfold based on where everything's positioned and ergonomics and everything else. So same type of thing of being prepared for a lease office negotiation. And unfortunately, it's just there's not enough time in the day, right? Eric, I can't get staff. Eric, I can't get, people to come in. My hygienist left, my office manager, I got a temporary, and I'm trying to do all this stuff on my own. And I'm the primary breadwinner to, drive production and collections into the business. I get it. So look at this as, how do we help to deal with this in the background without taking more time and energy? So part of it is data, right? And save your time of just, back and forth with landlords 9 to 5, et cetera. Obviously here we've got some forward-looking graphs and analytics moving forward. Your crystal ball is as good as mine, but it's interesting. Right now, there's been a lot of changes as it looks at, right? So national market growth rate year over year and availability. COVID has caused a great opportunity for a few things. Number one is a lot of landlords were caught flat-footed, and a lot of those that were retail heavy, especially the large ones, got hit hard last year. And it's interesting. It's now, in my opinion, completely changed the landlord's view of a dental tenant. Here's why. You make the best tenants on the planet, right? I may be a little biased, but I believe it, and I'm sure you do as well, right? You have the highest build-out costs, $150, $250, and some now, in some areas of the country, are up to $400 per square foot to build out a new dental practice, right? So from that perspective, very important to realize that you have a lot more leverage than you may anticipate. With that being said, right, you also bring in high quality foot traffic. You also, right, are COVID proof and cannot work from home, right? I haven't heard of one of you that, loaded your chair up into the back of your SUV, drove it home and set it up in your garage, right? So from that perspective, it has created a great, perhaps increased awareness and desire to secure a dental office tenant. And we just saw it. There's a great 5-star Google review. You can see that we leveraged this data in Boston, right? And we did the lease negotiation. It was just to renew the lease, right? And she was contemplating what to do as a next step. And we ended up just reaching out to the landlord down the street purely to determine ideally what we could do for the doctor. We then just put the fishing pole in the water just to see what the level of interest was. Needless to say, at the end of the day, that landlord down the street was desperate for a dental tenant and we were able to secure over $283,790 of tenant improvement allowance. So I share it because all of this data, when you use it skillfully, can pay for itself in spades. So let's jump into that. My old hometown in beautiful Los Angeles, California. Lots of shifts, lots going on down in Southern California. For those of you coming to us from the West Coast, right, we can see in orange the vacancy rates, which we did see at quite a high rate that was going into the pandemic. Pandemic only exacerbated it. But we do see things starting to level off as things come back to normal. And market rents didn't have the same impact, had a slight dip, but not as much as we saw when I moved there back 2009. So New York, obviously, similarly, wild changes. And certainly lots of people looking at now, hey, is now the right time to potentially relocate? Is now the time to expand? Is now the time, right, based on these factors? And that's a great question to ask. And we'll touch on the how here. Boston, right? A little different, much bigger swing in terms of rental rates, right? And vacancy rates a little more fluctuated. Houston, right? Similar graph. So these are just interesting, looking at the impact of 2020 and 2021 on the dental clinic and potential expectations of what the future may offer. Okay, so again, about the data, when we talk about, let it be demographics, when we talk about the vacancy rates, rental rates, et cetera, there's lots of markets right now where landlords are having lots of pressure from their lenders and the banks because of defaults, because of vacancies, and because a lot of landlords, et cetera, had some of the worst years of their lives last year. So in many cases, it makes it for a great time to be a tenant and a not so great time to be a landlord, which now you can use to your advantage. But the data helps to tell the story, to know what the comparables are in your market, to know what's fair and not fair. You need to have the data before jumping into it. Again, which we're happy to help share for all Schein clients. Now, let's talk about a few components. The old age question: buying versus leasing. As we jump into that, let's help customize the content today. Warren, if you can pull up the poll just to get a sense of, again, what status you're at, what specifically are you looking at and looking for, right? And how does your current lease situation fit in to that expansion, relocation, renovation is another great time to be renegotiating, or right, potentially now buying the existing real estate that you're in today, or potentially buying a building down the street and relocating your practice. So you should have a poll up. If you're zooming and driving, don't poll, but I appreciate you joining us. So feel free to tap through and just give us a quick update, and we'll certainly cover those components. So for those of you on the leasing side, of course, right, you've got a much smaller upfront payment. You've got and can use your working capital to build out the practice, add to marketing, et cetera. So principally, the vast majority of new associates want the flexibility and, quite frankly, need the flexibility to get into that sort of starter or initial type of practice, right? And if and when there's a need to expand or change, or let's say they just really don't like the area, there's a lot more flexibility there. Plus, it's a bit of a set it and forget it, meaning that if there's issues with the roofs and leakage, et cetera, that can be a problem. So alternatively, where we're at now is, right, having that flexibility that it's someone else's problem. The landlord's got to come in and fix it. Now, I'm sure there's 101 stories out there as we look through the chat and the Q&A sections here, lots of components popping up about, again, landlord issues. But let's look at the purchasing side at a high level. So here, right, of course, right, requires some large upfront financial investment. You are the landlord. You are, right, the world's oldest profession. You are the lord of the land. And therefore, you can then choose the type of work you do. You can choose how much you're paying yourself. You can also choose really how you want to structure your eventual estate and planning for your eventual transition, right? And with that comes the freedom. So those are lots of the positives from the high perspective. But in either case, right, as we can see in the middle, the lease oversects both. Let it be if you own, you still, right, want to have a lease that separates your corporation from your practice. All right. So here's some brand new content to share. And this is based on 2.5, almost 3 decades of talking to clients and talking about these questions. And we've come up with this, right? It's the $1 million question. Do I buy or do I build? Eric, what do I do? So I thought, right, what about just bottling all this up and sharing today? So the first question, and we call it the multi-million-dollar question, right? And adding the multi into it based on how expensive both the practice and real estate is these days. So number one, what is your long-term vision? That is, and by and large, such an important component. So what do we mean by that? Well, it means just about everything. It means how long have you been practicing for? What's been your experience so far, right? What have you enjoyed about it? What have you not enjoyed about it? What do you like about your location? What do you not like about your location? What do you like with your landlord? What do you not like about the landlord? What impact would it have if you were to relocate? Right, that long-term vision is important, and I'm very proud to be one of the faculty members at Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute, where typically 4 times a year, pre-COVID, would go in and do specific seminars to help doctors that had 2 or 3 locations get to 4 or 5, or 5 to 6, and 6 to 12, etc. And a lot of it was talking about this. So ask yourself, what does my 5-year and 10-year plan look like? Right? And is it to just be, right, a single location? Or is there the potential, even a small potential, of having a second or third or other location? Right? What happens if you have a great associate that wants to, right, instead of moving out, what about if they want to be partners into a new location? Right? These are the type of things you want to consider because, right, when you look up tying up the cost of capital, this can dramatically impact or potentially prevent you from expanding at the rate you were based on what you've done previously, let it be buying or building, buying or leasing the building. In addition to that, growth. And if you didn't watch the webinar earlier this week, Bob Gray, one of the foremost dental accountants in the country, really shared a lot of cautionary tales that especially younger, newer associates that were just getting their feet wet bought the clinic, right? May have bought the practice as well, right? Bought the practice and clinic and also the building. And interestingly, then they ran into a challenge 3 or 4 years later where suddenly they said, oh my God, I'm running out of space, right? The last doctor wasn't doing much hygiene, right? The last doctor had sort of, went down to 3 days a week. Now, right, I'm up to 6 days a week plus a whole hygiene team plus, right? I'm now almost looking towards an associate. And suddenly now we've got a problem. We're now, right, at capacity. You're now reaching out to Schein for the brand new stackable bunk bed type of dental chairs. They don't exist. Don't call your equipment rep on that. But you get my point, that suddenly you're going to be running out of room. And typically that trigger is about $250,000 of collections per chair. So as you're doing your financial analysis, business plans, and working with your professional team, start asking yourself, well, hey, hang on a second, right? If I'm now in a 3 operatory practice or just squeaking in a 4th or staff lounge, is that going to be enough? How quickly could you become a $750,000 practice? And then what do you do? At that point, you're pot committed. And then if you leave, who's going to come in and move in after you? And again, is someone going to have the capital to buy the building, or are you going to be stuck with that? So that's a key one for number 2, growth, size, and expansion. The other question, which is key, is the location. Is it something that you're in love with for the next 30 plus years? On average, the dental practice is in the same place for 26 years, usually on average. So when looking at it, right, really ask yourself, can I see myself driving here every day for the next 30 years? And or look around you, right? Is there a chance that the demographics might change, right? Is there going to be, low-income housing? What changes are going to be there? And is it aligned to your vision for your practice? That's certainly a major component to make sure, right? If you're a pedodontist, if you're an orthodontist, et cetera, you really want to know what that population pyramid looks like, right? And where your target audience is from age 1 to 21. Access to capital we touched on before, but that's huge. The banks will certainly, obviously, very anxious to loan, and they're trying to make up for lost time. Whether it be Bank of America or otherwise, that does a great job with dental specific lending and have some great programs, right? But it's certainly caution and to be looking through and to share your goals. If there's a chance that you might be wanting to open another practice in a few years, or there's another need for you personally, or buying a house or boat or otherwise, right? Just be cautious, right? As we all know, the FICO score dominates, and therefore looking at debt to equity or otherwise could have a big component to it. Plus, and we've all been through enough of them, right? Things fluctuate. and the real estate market has just been crazy. And right, no different than we said in 2006, 2007. Wow, this seems fantastic. And then, right, there could be a change. So just be cautious and prepare. It might not, but prepare for a downside. And for those doctors through COVID, a lot of them and a lot of calls said, boy, you know what? I wish I didn't necessarily take the big mortgage and the big practice loan. I would have much rather had some help from the landlord and deferred 3 months worth of leasing and just gone, and gone back to work. So that's number 4. Number 5 is the stage in your career. So certainly, typically, the new doctors, the flexibility is key. Right? This is your first business. This is your first employees. So you've got leases, you've got employee agreements, you've got equipment, you've got all sorts of things to figure out, right? Best to really look at what makes the best sense for you. Then when you're mid-career, right? Mid-career can be a bit of a sweet spot. You've still got lots of, energy. You've got lots of gas in the tank, as I say, and you're ready to, if you relocate and there's some patient attrition, or you're adding another 2 or 3 ops, you've got enough that you can come in, really ramp it up over the next 5 to 10 years and prepare for that eventual transition. For those of you that are looking to sell, now it gets a little more complicated. So you have technically now invested a long time into this location. And for a buyer to evaluate this, part of it is, right, the automation, the Tesla cars that are automatically driving to your practice because they've been doing it, as your patients have, for 20 odd years. That is a good opportunity to think through and look at your building and your practice through the eyes of the buyer. And the buyer may want ground floor retail, and you might have a standalone building that was built in 1950, as I was talking to a client about that today. Right? And the buyer, right, may not want to buy that real estate. The buyer may be very concerned about asbestos or, the old pipes or otherwise. That might be a significant cost far beyond what they've accounted for today. So that transition becomes very important. And we'll talk a lot about, for those of you contemplating potentially keeping the real estate and keeping it as a passive form of income, is certainly very, very important. So, and interesting stats, about a third of you are looking to acquire, right, and buy, let it be a practice or a building, and 22% of you are planning to relocate. Fantastic. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Now, how, right? So you're in the evaluation crossroads. Do I go left, right, to buy or build? Do I buy the real estate, right? And who's going to help me along the way? So the first piece is, what does the market look like? Is there 10 landlords? If you saw more than 4 lease signs on your drive to the office today, probably you've got a lot more leverage than you maybe anticipated. If you've now seen, because of COVID, that dry cleaner, that nail salon, that coffee shop that closed its doors, and it's a beautiful end cap unit that might be perfect to move into, you may be surprised at how much that landlord would love to fill that space with a rock solid tenant, especially one, landlord that might have a revolving door of tenants coming in and out. That's expensive. A lot of your markets right now are coming through that it could be 12, 14, even 16 months on market, meaning from the time that they put up that lease sign to the time that someone's in and rocking can be upwards of 16 months. That's a big cost. And if you were to ever leave or relocate, right, my advice is, in terms of the evaluation, is how could you possibly determine if now is the time to relocate if you don't know what the best possible deal is with the existing location, right? And what the best possible deal is with the location down the road, right? And what I mean by that is, one of the strategies we're doing for some of our 400 active clients is talking about having our cake and eating it too, which is a simple process to make sure that, that we've got the guidance to help, and you've got someone in your corner to help be the devil's advocate, to say, okay, look, here's what your current landlord is willing to do to keep you. Here's the new base rate. Here's the reduced annual increases. Here's the tenant improvement allowance to fix the floors and add new paint, et cetera, right? Maybe here's some free rent in some cases. or other components to help retain you, because I'm sure they don't want it to be sitting vacant for another 6 to 12 to 24 months. In addition to that, really when considering it is then, right, really helping to determine what's best for you and then determining what that new location looks like. What's that landlord down the street or what's that building owner down the street willing to do, right, to either sell it, or if it's a lease, what are they going to do to entice you? And there's multiple examples. There was a doctor that shared a beautiful 5-star Google review recently who was 74 years of age. She tried to sell her practice 3 separate times. The landlord was another tenant in the unit, had a restaurant, and would not allow her to sell the practice. Just would not assign the lease. And if you can't assign the lease, what's the practice worth? So at 74 years of age, she hired us. We relocated her 10 minutes north. And luckily, we were able to get the landlord to cover the entire build-out costs in terms of landlord work. Now, of course, this doesn't happen every day, but it's a great reminder as to what some landlords are willing to do to secure that type of tenancy. So that's another thing to share. And could you imagine being at the end of your career and being forced to go through a full relocation, build out, et cetera, at the end of your career? So the best thing to do is plan early and work closely with your team, right? Get your professional team in. The equipment team at Henry Schein is second to none, right? We work hand in glove with them, no different than the practice transitions team, et cetera, to help make sure that we are one entity and you're feeling like you have one professional team moving all in the same direction. So, really determine when you're relocating, right? Have them look at that space, have them measure it out, have them really talk about the current techniques, right? In terms of patient flow, right? Is it now open bay, closed bay, right? On the orthodontic side, what has COVID done with that? What are the best practices? All those ideas are fantastic, right? And then when it comes to the lease, start figuring out what is the rentable square footage, right? What is the usable square footage? And how much are you really going to be responsible for it when looking at the total cost? A few other components here just to add on, right? The age of the building, liability, right? If you own the business and the practice in the same entity, that's the good old deep well theory. And in the event of any disputes or otherwise, that's one bucket to go after. So in many cases, your accountants or otherwise would suggest having a corp for your practice, right, and having a corp for your building. The other components, talking to a doctor recently down in South Florida, who is now looking to relocate their clinic into basically a 2-unit space, and then there's 3 other locations, 3 other units, and they're just starting to see now how much of a headache tenants can be. Is there a lease in place? Are they month to month? Is there $30,000 of deposit that the tenant's going to claim that you, the building, owe them, right? Because now you've bought the building. So if you're, especially in a multi-tenant situation, be cautious, slow down, and realize that could be a full-time job for you. And I heard an example, I don't have one here, but there was an example where the tenant next door came in basically with a plunger and said, hey, doc, right? My toilet's plugged. What are you going to do for me? So obviously not aligned with COVID protocols. That was pre-COVID, but that's part of the conversation, is be sure that you're aware, even with a single location, you're the one that they call. You are the one that you call when things go wrong, right? And that can be a second full-time job. So from now, looking at it from the leasing perspective, let's look at this and ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one is, right, when does your lease expire? So as a quick piece on a quick back of the napkin, when does your lease expire? Right, put that in your phone. Also, when is your option to renew deadline date? If you have not exercised your option, or you're not aware of when that date is, and you think, oh no, I got a 20-year lease. Most likely not. You might have a 5-year lease with 2 or 3 5-year options, but right, dug in there on page 67 on Article 47, subsection C, right, subsection I, it states that if you don't give the landlord more than 3 months, 6 months, 12 months worth of notice, those options become null and void. So, right, of course, the landlord would love, from a negotiation perspective, to have those additional 3 or 4 or 5-year options go away, right? And then suddenly you've lost a lot of leverage in the next negotiation. And all the good work you did originally is now for naught. When do you want to transition, right? Are your options transferable, especially for those doctors joining us from the West Coast? If your practice is, in your lease, typically we see that options are personal to the original tenant, meaning that that's great for you. You might have another 10 years worth of options. However, right, they're not transferable to the buyer, meaning that if you were to sell your practice at year 9 of a 10-year lease and you sell it to Dr. Smith then does the valuation, et cetera, then at the 11th hour goes to assign the lease. But suddenly now the bank, right, and their underwriters say, whoa, right? As it stands, there's only 1 year left on the lease, good for the doctor. Now all the power goes back to the hands of the landlord. So again, be sure you're aware of these components. Also, are you personally liable? Right? Did you give a personal guarantee? A lot of doctors are shocked to know that they did or signed an indemnification without really understanding what impact that could have. And for many of you, that gives the landlord the opportunity to not only go after, or it opens up exposure potential to both your individual, any personal assets, et cetera, right? And that could be for lack of payment or other types of damages. Also, continuing liability. You want to be aware within your lease, I would probably say at least 75% of the leases we see, the tenant is shocked to know that even after they sell their practice and transfer the lease, they remain continually and personally liable even after the sale. We've seen devastating examples of these over the years. In the essence of time, let's continue through. Another big component are demolition and relocation. These are becoming much more common. And from a practice valuation, a lot of different practice brokers are looking at those now and saying, well, hang on a second. If the landlord has the right to relocate you in 2 years from now, we're going to assess a $250 per square foot penalty and then, right, deduct that from your valuation of the practice. All because, right, to be fair to the buyer, that's when the landlord could wake up one morning, right, put the brown envelope on your door and say, unfortunately, doctor, you're out. So rate the state of your estate as it pertains to the lease. Now, in terms of financial negotiables, I touched on this before, but for those of you contemplating next steps or contemplating relocating, like approximately 25% of you, right, really make sure that you've got all the numbers. Don't make the decision without knowing, hey, if I do relocate and I relocate to a plaza, what's that landlord really going to do for me versus what's the $1.5 million I need to buy the building and build it out from scratch? Leave enough for the equipment, leave enough to set it up properly. And the last thing you'd want is to run out of money because now you've double dipped. So from that perspective, 7 main financial variables. We touched on a few of them before, but any one of them are very negotiable. And you would be surprised what some landlords are willing to do these days, again, to attract or to retain an existing dental tenant or even a new dental tenant, right? But especially if you've got an existing location, the landlord should look at you with a gold sign, right? With a gold bar around your neck, if you will, it's going to be a great, reliable tenant and bring in high quality foot traffic from day one. So speaking of the relocation, here's a little practical component of today. Again, a reminder for the tons of doctors that have joined us here on a great Friday afternoon. Feel free to add in some Q&A and happy to address as we go as well. Okay, so relocation. So this is something to be keenly aware of. What is it? It gives the lease and within the lease, it gives the landlord the opportunity to, usually their sole and unfettered discretion, to wake up one morning and to say, you know what, I think Dr. Brown is going to move from suite A to all the way back to suite Z, right? Why? Because suddenly, right, we'd love to have a large coffee chain in there. We'd love to mix the tenant mix, or more likely, right, there's a larger tenant that wants to take over that space. And you are the one element in the way. So unfortunately, what do you think is going to happen? Are your 1,000 square feet going to stand versus someone that's looking at 20,000 square feet? Right? And where's the landlord going to be? So this is important. If this is in your lease, and I would suggest to many of you to open up the digital copy and follow along as we go. This can be hidden in about 7 or 8 different sections within the lease. Miscellaneous clause. This could be hidden within the other items clause. This could be hidden in as a relocation, but typically it's buried into some of the fine print. Thank you, Mr. Landlord, or Mrs. Landlord from that perspective. So here's an example. So let's take a quick second to have a look at this. This is an example from one of the leases that we've reviewed in the past. So take a quick minute to see what issues you can find in the lease. At this point, usually in person, I say, and who really loves reading leases? Okay. What did you notice first? Well, first of all, even at the very beginning, the landlord may at any time upon 60 days notice, and by the way, it's almost always 60 days notice, to relocate the premises, right? Premises to premises reasonably comparable in size, right? So let's just pause there for a second. Reasonably comparable in size. First of all, it might be 2,000 square feet and similar to what it has today. But if it's a funky, weird layout, good luck trying to fit in the same 4 or 5 or 6 separate operatories. Number one. Number two is with that relocation, right? You might be taking on a larger space, right? And therefore paying additional rent. So, right, this again is not dental specific. It's not dental specific language. And for those of you that own or contemplating owning, these are things to think about, especially now if you become your own landlord or, right, retain ownership of your building and then become a full-time landlord to whomever you eventually sell to. Number two, right, the tenant will reopen for business to the public in the new premises by the date set out by the landlord's notice of relocation. So guess what? You're going to be open or forced to be open. And how long is it going to take you to build out a new dental clinic? A lot more than 30 days, right? Or 60 days in this case. So be cautious of that because it's not even lack of production. It's the patient attrition. And for each and every month that your lights out, could easily be upwards of 10% that patients go down the street and never come back. So be cautious of this type of language. Interestingly as well, right? The rent will be adjusted based on the gross leasable area of the lease premises. So now your triple nets could be going up, right? And any other additional rents aligned with that. And then last but not least, and we sort of paraphrase this, but typically look for those little notwithstanding clauses. The provisions hereof are to be construed broadly in favor of the landlord. Thank you. Right? If the tenant objects to the relocation or location of the new premises, the landlord may elect to terminate the lease upon 30 days notice. This was exactly the same of a lease review I was doing last night for a doctor in Florida, and it was almost word for word the same. So this is very common. And yes, so, well, hey, I'll just object. I'm not going to do that. Right? Well, if that's the case, right, you've now just walked into the trap and you're out in 30 days. So, and interestingly, another doctor in Los Angeles, lease I was reviewing, it said, good news, the landlord's going to cover 100% of the costs, up to including a maximum of 2 months lease payment. 2 months lease payment, excuse me. So one little clause, right, the potential of hundreds of thousands of dollars of risk. Okay. Now, let's talk about a few components here as well. Some things that may be missing from your lease, right, are things like a right of first refusal. And for those of you, again, for about the 25% of you that are contemplating relocating, it might not be as easy as you think. Make sure somebody looks at your lease. And if the lease is coming up for expiry in May, right? Well, we deal with that all the time. In some cases, There's options of going, on a shorter term lease, or making sure that you're not caught, double dipping rent, or right, suddenly being done one without having another one ready. But be cautious when you're leaving, because it might not be that simple. A lot of individual examples, there's language in there to return it to either the condition it looked like when you moved in, gray shell, vanilla shell, etc., or it could be more broad, that simply states that for any leasehold improvements you have, the landlord can have you remove it, even though you didn't put it in the first place. Why? Well, of course, think about it. If you're leaving and the landlord's walking around with their clipboard, who do you think they would rather incur that $10,000 to $15,000 worth of demolition cost? You or the landlord, right? By bottom line, make sure that you've protected yourself. Spend your money on the good stuff, the intraoral scanners, CAD cams, right, et cetera. Right? Use that as an opportunity to make sure that you don't let money go out unnecessarily to the landlord, when I'm sure you can find a lot better places for it. Okay, buying. Okay, could be a great option. Depends specifically on those crossroad questions we talked about before. So from that, ask yourself, what's the state of your estate? And I can't suggest enough, myself, right, getting into business ownership, etc. Make sure you've updated your wills and estate planning, and talk to your family lawyer about that, because you might, you may be surprised that your lease, right, and or mortgage, etc., can be tied to your successors and heirs. And there was a devastating example north of our office of a doctor that was 43 years of age, who built a beautiful practice, and 3 weeks prior to the grand opening, passed away to a massive heart attack. Fully built in practice, no doctor, no patients. Guys, how much is that practice worth? So zero, even less, based on the loans and payments, etc. But unfortunately, the spouse was then responsible for the almost $9,000 a month lease, right, for the remaining 9.5 years on the lease, increasing at 4% per year. So my purpose of mentioning this is, again, whether you buy, right, or whether you lease, always plan for the worst. There was another tragic example of a doctor who unfortunately passed away when his plane crashed. And as a result, there was leases that were not in place. And it took quite a while to help structure a lease to properly separate the building from the practice in order to facilitate the sale. So if you buy, just as important to have the lease. Who owns your building? Is it in your name personally or your corporation? Who owns your practice? Is it in your name personally or your corporation? Right? Start to think about now from a tax planning perspective, from a liability perspective, right? Most professional guidance would, and most doctors we talk to, have 2 separate corporations, yet have a very clear lease that defines who is responsible for what. Now, the other question is, are you paying yourself rent today? Oh, Eric, you know what? I'm paying everything, but is it a set amount? Right? Is it a set amount you're paying yourself, or every now and again I sort of move some money around? That can be an issue, right? Audit, taxation, etc. You want to make sure that you've got a very clear example as to which company has which obligations, and right, to make sure that it's in alignment with market price. Not just, hey, I'm paying, triple myself because I want to pay down the mortgage a little faster. Right? That could be a significant issue. You should certainly talk to your accountant about that. How are you tracking your building expenses? A lot of people make the error of using the same credit card to buy a handpiece, then, and the same one to, fix the roof. And then when it comes time to sell, and for those of you that want to maintain ownership, right, of your building and have a nice little tenant as a passive form of income, great. But when you go to sell, suddenly all of those financials are now jumbled into one, and it becomes that much more difficult to separate them. So again, do you have a lease in place, right? Do you have a will set up, et cetera? And when you sell, right, do you plan to keep that building? So rate yourself, quick scale of 1 to 10 based on the state of your estate. Now, why, right? Why, if you own your building, do you want to have a lease? Well, I just mentioned the first is from an accounting perspective, right? Having a clear document that separates the two that covers all of the financial responsibilities for one versus the other, right? Number two is liability, right? Is who's responsible for shoveling, slips and falls or otherwise. How do you clearly delineate to the roles and responsibilities to each corporation? Number three, an evaluation, right? How, based on using that same credit card, how do you really value the practice when it's all sort of been one jumbled combined entity? That's fine for you, but right, 10 years prior to eventual transition, now is the time to help structure that properly. And then, of course, value of the building. Think about it as to maybe it's an investor that would want to buy in. Having a nice, solid, long-term lease with a great, grade A dental tenant with, a solid lease, great cap rates, et cetera, that can only help to differentiate your business and your building if you're ever to sell. Okay, so now into some of the real core components here for those of you that own your own or are thinking about owning your own building. These are the things to consider to help structure the right dental specific lease. So number one is, and this is a big question. I always get this. Oh, you know what? It's just myself. Let's just have an easy, simple, really friendly kind of lease because it's me and I'm paying for it myself. Yes, but twofold. Number one is ask yourself what happens if you pass away. Well, that lease really is no good. You're going to need something else in there anyways. And then number two, think about it from the buyer's perspective. If now suddenly you need to sell or lower back pain or carpal tunnel or hand tremors, et cetera, something that's going to accelerate your transition plan. If and only if you needed to transition that quickly, then, and the ink is still wet, right, on your lease, that's only going to be an additional red flag. And it's going to be a great opportunity for the buyer to then say, well, hey, you just created this yourself, right, on the back of a napkin. Well, I want to renegotiate it, right? Versus imagine having a well-structured lease, dental specific lease from 5, 10, 15 years ago that suddenly you've been paying and using, right, which is very landlord friendly because, hey, who cares? You're paying yourself, right? But it's very landlord friendly. And then how easy is it to say, oh, well, no, Dr. Smith, this is the lease that I've been using for the past 10, 15 years, and let me just transition it on. Right. So again, these are the type of things to be considering, and probably you wouldn't even have thought of necessarily. But the lease and the timing, especially early, is the best time to get these things structured. And then you just put it in the drawer and move things on. So that's the first one. Write it as if, right, you're the landlord and not the tenant. Number two, think about, right, what types of leases, triple net, gross or modified gross, who's paying for what? How long is that going to take your bookkeeper or yourself to judge some of those costs? What are the future costs, right? What are the building potentially going to have for future costs? Does the roof have to be done? Does the parking lot have to be done? Who's going to pay? A lot of landlords much prefer the triple net. And there could be, I would suggest you watch the webinar earlier that I did with Bob Gray earlier this week, right? Because he touches on some of the tax advantages of some of these over another. But bottom line, think about this first, and not only think about it for the time that you're going to own the building, but what about afterwards, right? And think about the lease as helping to put a protective force field around the eventual practice sale proceeds. And that's what I'm referring to for number three. Number four is rental rates, right? What are you paying yourself? How do you know it's based on market? And what do you have to substantiate that in the event of an audit or otherwise? So make sure you know, and that could work more to your advantage, right? If it's a little higher, that might work out to your advantage, right? In terms of your overall net worth perspective. Guarantees and continuing liability. So that's another key one, not only for really, it's the new tenant to think of. So now you're the full-time landlord, and now you're contemplating how much you're going to charge them and what happens if they don't pay. They've just paid you $1 million for your practice. Now you've got this extra lease. For those of you looking to acquire, which was about a third of you, you need to be conscious of that as well. Don't let a great deal be hampered by a boat anchor of a lease. And so many doctors spend 98% of their time negotiating the agreement of purchase and sale and buying the practice, that suddenly the lease is the 11th hour and, oh, it's a lease on here. Yet the lease is probably going to be a $1 to $2 million commitment over the next 20 years, right? So really make sure you've got your priorities straight and don't rush it, and be aware, at least if nothing else, be aware of what's in it. Alterations. So this is the question now, and I'm speaking to the owners of the real estate here. If you're going to sell, and if you're going to sell the practice, ask yourself, how much control do you want to have if they come in and turn everything, the walls fluorescent yellow, right? And make it 70s theme and bring back the shag rugs. I don't know. But, how much control do you want to have in approvals if they want to come in and, bulldoze and make all sorts of changes? What happens if a DSO wants to come in and make some major changes, right? It's a question of control. And after you've spent your blood, sweat, and tears, do you really want them to, change all this out, considering you're still the business owner, building owner? Number 7 is leaseholds and trade fixtures. This is another big one. So if you own the building, ask yourself, well, hey, what if that doctor wants to relocate in 3 or 4 or 5 years? And suddenly they want to rip out all of those beautiful A-deck cabinets that you put in, right? Or they want to, really pull out a lot of the other components that you feel they are part of the leaseholds. They're part of my building, and therefore you're not taking that anywhere. So properly defining who owns what, right? And be clear, if they were to ever leave, right, what would you be left with? And that's important when it comes down to the value. And then the other big question that really no one contemplates is, let's say, and there's lots of them, let's say it's a buyer that's a doctor that typically flips practices. So you like Dr. Smith buying your practice, you've got a good relationship, good rapport, heck, maybe you're an associate for him or her, right? And then suddenly, a couple of years later, he ramps up production, sells it for a great premium. And now, wait a second, right? Dr. Green, right, is, maybe concerns about reputation. Maybe the credit report was not so beneficial. Now the question is, right, could you get stuck with a tenant that you don't agree with or otherwise, or you have concerns with? So these are the type of things to ask yourself, is not only whom you're selling to, but also whom they may sell to in the future. You're the landlord, right? And you're stuck. And if it's a very difficult tenant, then you've got a massive pain on your hands. The last thing you need going into retirement. So, and last but not least, when we look at things like a right to purchase, right, a right of first refusal, these are the type of things to be keenly aware of. So for the buyers, hey, you don't have to buy the real estate right now. Why not have your cake and eat it too, right? Why not structure a great lease, but give your buyer the option to buy it after 5 years or 10 years, or at least give them the option to match the price. There was another terrible example, Arizona, Flagstaff, if memory serves, and the doctor passed away. But before that occurred, a competitor had actually snuck in, bought the unit without the doctor knowing, and the frustration and the issues, right, that occurred between the landlord competitor, right, who obviously wanted to take over that space, and then the doctor passed away. So, right, for the buyers out there, right, having that right of first refusal can protect yourself from a big DSO gobbling up the whole mall, or, right, buying up a specific unit, or a competitor, right, that's enterprising, that wants to take over the unit, right, and then just not renew your lease. They're the landlord, right, and then suddenly you're out. Okay. So again, a reminder, I'm sure lots of questions have popped up. Feel free to add any additional ones here to the Q&A as we start to wrap up. This is a great tool. Email me a copy. I'm happy to share with all of you there. It does help to break down, where does the dentist fall into the process in terms of buying or building? Where does, right, a firm like ours, let it be creating a lease or negotiating a lease, et cetera, right? What's the role for a broker? What's the role for your equipment partner, right? And as a key part, get them involved as early as possible, right? They're obviously going to need to know which space you're looking for. So it wouldn't be at the very, very beginning, but the second you start to land on a specific location, leverage them, right? They do an incredible job, an incredible layout, right? And they're there to share their best practices. And, it's a great opportunity to contemplate how many chairs, what the location is, what the best practices are. And there's a lot of knowledge there. So can't stress enough to leverage your local ESS partner, right? And you can certainly email us. We can help to connect you, or talk to your local FSC, your field sales consultant. So again, using your equipment partner, let it be now general contractor, designer, zoning, right, approvals, etc., financial institutions. Bottom line is, if you're in this stage, the most important thing is to how you assemble your professional team. So as we wrap and go to questions, some of the main components here are an appreciation of everyone's time. Today, obviously on a Friday afternoon, it's a little dreary where I am, but hopefully it's a little better where you are. We waive the fees for a complimentary lease review or rental rate analysis. So if you own your own building and you have or don't have a lease, you should have it looked at. If your lease is a 2-pager that your accountant gave to you when you were closing on it and said, yeah, you really should have a lease or something I found on the internet, right? Definitely don't delay. Right? Let's pull the Band-Aid off, get it done, get it fixed. And just, it's one last thing on the list. And again, COVID's showed us one thing particularly is that, right? Expect the unexpected. So be prepared. And if you've seen the value to do your will and estate planning, then equally, right, having a proper lease in place is also quite important. So from that perspective, there'll be a quick poll that'll pull up here. So a quick button. And we can help to schedule that for you, myself or one of the team, and perhaps even just a quick call if you're curious about your specific situation. Right? And from that perspective, you have a lease, right? Let it be you own or you're in a lease, right, as a tenant. Is number one. Number two is, when does your lease expire? Right? And if you don't have a lease or you own, are the bottom two choices. For those of you that may have a urgent situation, let's say a transition is imminent over the next year or so, or let's say your lease is coming up in the next 2 years, please mark urgent. We'll help to prioritize those. We've had almost 600 doctors register that we've been following up with for scheduling these types of courses and follow-ups for lease reviews. So again, if it's something that is quite time sensitive, please mark urgent. And for those of you month to month, be cautious. If you're saying, I just want to wait to see where the dust settles and where I'm going to go next, be cautious, because the landlord could wake up 30 days notice and now you're scrambling. I was with one of the local Schein representatives in New Jersey, Newark, and it was a terrible situation. The doctor was forced to relocate. He had 2 or 3 weeks and they had to just scramble to get a new office set up. And they ended up paying a massive premium in rent, purely because the landlord knew they could. Right? So the more time you have, the better. And to give it a little bit of time, as promised, for a little Q&A, feel free to throw in some additional Q&A, either into the chat or into the Q&A section. Okay, looking through. I'm a 32-year-old dentist and I'm contemplating next steps. What should be the trigger point to contemplating buying a building? So for Dr. A, one of the questions I would say here is a few things. You're early in your career. That's great. Assess, right? Assess your estate, right? Do you still have student loans? Is there any previous, perhaps practice loan that you're still paying on? And does it really make sense to take on all that additional expense and capital at this stage in your career? So there may be a great opportunity to purchase a location, but have you spent enough time in that location to really ensure that you're protected there? Another question here: do you offer your services to Canadian clients as well? Yes. Usually about 40% of the clients we work with are north of the border in Canada. And I'm currently in Canada today. So yes, happy to assist for those as well, and data there. Another question from Dr. S. In situations where there is a landlord allowance, does the landlord fund that directly, or does the doctor/bank need to fund and landlord reimburse after? Also, can you detail the difference between a triple net lease and full service or full gross lease? Sure. So 2 great questions, Dr. S. Number one is, so tenant TIA, or tenant incentive allowance, or tenant improvement allowance, as it's commonly referred to, can be great. So let me talk about what it is, how it works, and then how it can be paid. In short, in a lot of my courses and CE courses, talk about it as sort of a fool's gold. You might think it's fantastic. Oh my gosh, Jason, this is great. The landlord's going to give me $40 a square foot. Or Eric, they're going nuts. They're going to give me $100 per square foot. They said it's because I'm building the beautiful practice, and they're in love with me and my vision and everything else, right? But don't forget the biggest misnomer. The landlord is not in the lending business. The landlord is interested in two things: term and rent, right? That's what it boils down to. So therefore, it's not free money. Be cautious. I'm not saying don't take any. I'm not saying eliminate it or otherwise. Every landlord's unique, especially in a new development where they're very focused on the highest face rate, the highest average payment they're focused on. But be cautious with it, right? Instead of $100 per square foot, part of what we do and the software we utilize can help find out what's the best for you. And some of the examples we've done where we've negotiated a sort of before and after, well, maybe by reducing the tenant improvement allowance in half, and then going to Bank of America or others that have money's as close to free as I've ever seen in my life, right? Going and getting a great long-term loan, 10, 12 years, whatever, right? How does that work? So that's a major component to potentially look at the loans. You know exactly how you're paying it off. If not, where do you think that money comes from? Typically, it's going to come from you in the terms of increased rent or annual increases. And then in your lease, when it comes time to renew, at the end of 10 years, guess what it says in your option to renew? It can never be less. So now you bumped up your base rent or annual increase, right? So the landlord's now making back their money, and right, you're on the world's most boring roller coaster. It's just going up and up and up indefinitely. So, right, part of what we do through our process with our lease negotiators is to look at it. Well, hey, what if we had less tenant improvement allowance? What can we do then to reduce the base rent? What does that look like over 5 to 10 to 15 years? The last example I did, it was almost $150,000 difference between taking the tenant improvement allowance up front versus taking less, right, and getting a further reduced rent or annual increase. Don't underestimate, right? Look at the lease as if it's a check, the largest check that you're about to sign to any entity in your lifetime, both personally or professionally. Take your monthly payment, multiplied by the annual increase, right? Equals in your calendar, in your calculator, all the way for 15 to 20 years. This could easily be a multi-million-dollar commitment. Make sure you get it right on the front. So hopefully, Dr. S, that we covered that one there. Another question from Anonymous. I missed part 1 of the webinar. The tax saving strategy. So just to know, so the part 1. So that was on Tuesday of this week, if memory serves. So yes, there is the links. Corin, perhaps we can do that as part of our follow-up email. But yes, we could perhaps include both if you'd like, as a next step. So that was one with Bob Gray. You can also see that through the website for the Henry Schein Dental Academy. But we'll make a note to include both of those as part of the reminder. It's a great one, and it was some similar content. And that was one through the, this is through the equipment team. This was one that was through the practice services and dental academy. So it might be a separate mailing list. So that might be another opportunity to share that one as well. Or we can make a note of that. Perfect. So that one's covered. And hi, Eric. Let me know if you've heard of this question before. But my area is oversaturated with dentists. Where is a good location to open if one does not want to practice in one of the more rural locations? So great question. So on a very high level, I think the core question is where do I go? And how do I determine that? Part of my view is take your time, figure out your life plans. Myself, I've got 2 young kids. Really make sure that you've thought it through. For example, living years in California, knowing that, right, we didn't want to raise kids without family close by. So be cautious, right? It's a lot easier to figure out, to end up, to start where you want to be and go from there. Look, of course, there's going to be lots of areas that are oversaturated. Just, talking to one of the dentists in New York, and there's some of those locations, they've got 30 doctors in the same building. So there is no shortage of demand, right, coming in. There's no shortage of growth and potential. So really think about it like the business, right? Where's the old Wayne Gretzky? Where's the puck going to go? So thinking about where are the developing communities, where are areas that you can get into a little bit beforehand, determine where you want to go personally, because that, you could be in the best location on the planet, but if you don't want to live there and you're driving 2 hours every day and you're cursing, right, and kicking yourself stuck in traffic, it's really about determining what's best for you over the long run. Again, feel free to discuss and reach out. And happy to pull up specifics, right? Especially if you're in a rural location and contemplating moving into a more urban city. Okay, and another question here: if the seller has someone to do the appraisal, how do I know if it was fairly done? Aha, excuse me. So the question here, I think, is sort of the integrity of the practice broker. So that's a great question. Of course, there's tons of them. A lot of doctors, when they retire, want to get in the practice brokerage game, and they're sort of doing it part-time. I think the easiest answer is to get multiple appraisals, right? That's a great way of doing it. And then also follow the money. No different, right? If you're about to open a new practice and you're talking to a local broker, right, that could be great. There's great brokers out there. But don't forget, they're being paid by the landlord and could easily be getting $10,000, $20,000+ in commissions just for, right, putting a doc in a box. Right. Our view is very different. We want to help ensure that we can help the doctor get the best possible rate, right, without any commissions from the landlord. Right. So how do we help to best structure that for you to minimize your costs over the long run? Again, where's the money going? So I think perhaps to answer that best question on the brokerage side is you can get multiple appraisals. And then, of course, some are going to be more expensive than others. So part of it's network, part of it's growth. Just talking to Greg Orbach, who's one of the primary practice transition specialists in North Florida, and his father's a dentist in South Florida. There's great resources to talk to, and you assess. But if you've got issues or some credibility challenges, et cetera, get a second opinion. As it pertains to the lease, right? Definitely before you sell, it's far easier to renegotiate while there's 3, 4, even 1 year worth of runway than it is upon sale. Well, what's the landlord going to do for you? You're on the way out anyways. And by the way, if you're the seller, be very cautious. I wouldn't let the buyer go anywhere near the landlord because, right, they're going to say, hey, yeah, sure, Dr. Smith's going to stay on. Personally, continually liable, no problems. Right? Yet you're the one that's going to be then on the hook afterwards. So again, if any of these things have been sort of interesting or you want to talk more specifically about your situation, there was the poll, right? Or feel free to email us at info at consulting group, cirrusconsultinggroup.com or henryscheindental.com/Cirrus. Corin, I think we've covered most. I see almost all the doctors are still with us. I'll pass it back to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Eric, for the great presentation today and for answering these questions. If you have any additional questions, you can always email us at webinars@henryschein.com. And as a thank you for attending, everyone will receive the recording via email in the next week. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday, everybody. Have a great day. Bye now.